I want you to picture a set of vintage brass scales.
Oh, like the kind you might see sitting in the window of an old apothecary shop.
Yeah, that is spot on. Or maybe resting on the velvet counter of a high-end jeweler.
Right.
So imagine taking two identical, perfectly calibrated weights and placing them on both sides of the mechanism. The brass arms tremble for a second, oscillating back and forth.
Just kind of weighing it out.
Yeah, and then they settle. They lock into absolute perfect stillness, complete equilibrium.
A totally balanced state.
Right. Now, I want you to imagine trying to make a choice, like a significant moral decision in your life. But you are demanding that your own heart and your own mind remain in that very state of perfectly balanced, motionless neutrality.
Which is pretty hard to imagine.
It is. You are not allowed to tip to the left or tip to the right until the very microsecond you make the decision. We like to tell ourselves that human freedom looks like that perfectly balanced scale.
We really do. We like to think we operate from a place of complete, uninfluenced neutrality.
But when we actually take a wrench to the mechanics of human choice and look under the hood, that perfect balance turns out to be a total illusion.
It is an incredibly persistent illusion, though. I mean, it is the default setting for how most people view the world today.
Oh, for sure.
We naturally assume that true, authentic freedom requires a blank slate. We think we need a state of mind where our desires, our history, and our inclinations do not push us in any particular direction before we act.
Like any push at all is somehow a violation of our freedom.
Precisely. There is this inherent assumption that if the scale is already tipped before we even approach a decision, we are somehow less free. We assume bias destroys liberty.
Well, welcome to this deep dive on reform thinking. Today we are undertaking a massive mission. We are pulling a very specific stack of sources onto the table to take a rigorous look at Jonathan Edwards' classic 1754 theological and philosophical text, Freedom of the Will.
It is a heavy book.
It really is.
Mm-hmm.
And along with Edwards' original work, we're pulling in historical analysis of the 18th century debates, notes on the writings of his primary opponents, and the theological guardrails of the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Which is going to be incredibly helpful for keeping us grounded.
Definitely. Specifically, we're going to dissect Edwards' devastating systematic critique of the Arminian concept of liberty of indifference.
And that phrase, liberty of indifference is the technical term for that perfectly balanced brass scale you just described.
Okay, right.
It was the prevailing academic theory of Edwards' day. It was championed by Arminian theologians who believed that for any human choice to have moral value, the human will had to be entirely indifferent.
Neutral.
Yes, neutral right up until the moment of choosing. For an action to be genuinely praiseworthy or blameworthy, you had to have that total equilibrium.
Look, whether you are sweating through a seminary midterm right now, studying the Westminster Confession with your church, or you are just someone trying to figure out how your own daily choices fit into God's absolute sovereignty, this framework is going to fundamentally alter how you see human action.
It really shifts your whole paradigm.
It does. And we are going to take our time with this.
Yeah.
We are laying down some ground rules for this conversation.
Good.
We're going to maintain a steady rhythm. We will not talk over one another. And we're going to give these massive philosophical arguments plenty of room to breathe.
Sounds good. To set our baseline, the theological framework we will be operating from today is the affirmation that true freedom is not the ability to choose without bias.
Right. The Reformed view is completely different.
It is. In the Reformed view, true freedom is simply acting according to our greatest desire. We choose what we want most in the moment of choosing.
So to really test this Arminian idea that true freedom requires absolute neutrality, we are not going to start by analyzing human beings.
No, that would be too easy.
Yet, we are going straight to the very top of the cosmic hierarchy. We are going to look at God himself. Let's test their theory.
I love this approach.
Right. If the Arminian definition of freedom is accurate, how does it apply to a perfectly holy God?
This is where Edwards proves his brilliance as a logician. He does not just attack the weak points of an argument. He takes the opponent's strongest premise and pushes it to its absolute logical conclusion.
He stress tests it.
He absolutely does. Edwards looks at the arguments of prominent Arminian thinkers of his era, specifically focusing on a man named Dr. Daniel Whitby.
And Whitby was a pretty big deal back then, right?
Oh, Whitby was a heavy hitter. He championed the idea that for an action to be virtuous, it must be completely free from necessity. Whitby argued that you cannot praise someone for doing something they could not avoid doing.
So if you're forced, you get no credit.
Right. To summarize his logic, he essentially claimed that if an action is necessary, then virtue and vice are just empty words. You need freedom from outside coercion, yes, but Whitby insisted you also need freedom from internal necessity. You must possess the raw ability to do otherwise in any given situation.
So let me make sure I'm tracking with this. If I understand Whitby's rules, if an individual is guaranteed to do the right thing, if it is completely impossible for them to fail, they get zero credit for doing it.
Precisely. The ability to choose evil is, in Whitby's mind, a strict prerequisite for getting credit for choosing good.
That is quite a standard.
It is, and Edwards takes that precise logic and holds it up against the nature of God. Arminians and Calvinists completely agree on one fundamental truth: God is necessarily holy.
Right. His will is eternally determined to do good.
Yes. It is completely impossible for God to sin. He cannot lie. He cannot choose to be evil. Therefore, Edwards points out the fatal flaw.
Here it comes.
According to strict Arminian logic, God has no virtue. Because God is under a necessity of his own divine nature to be good, he actually deserves no praise, no commendation, and no honor for his goodness.
That is a terrifying conclusion.
It really is.
When you actually play that theory out in real time, the result is totally absurd. You read the Psalms, you read the prophets, you read the entire span of Scripture, and the text constantly magnifies, honors, and exalts God, specifically because of his unchangeable holiness.
Right. He is praised because he cannot change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that is spot on. What stands out here is how Edwards draws out the practical implications of Whitby's stance.
He is so good at doing that. If internal necessity negates virtue, then God's goodness is categorically no different than a raw physical property of nature.
Like gravity or something.
Yeah, Edwards uses phenomenal examples here. He points to the brightness of the sun or the fertility of the earth. We all acknowledge that the sun is incredibly bright and gives life-sustaining heat. But we do not attribute moral virtue to a star.
No, we don't.
We do not write hymns praising a rock for being hard or water for being wet.
Right, because it's just nature doing its thing.
Precisely. If Whitby is right, God's holiness is just a natural, unavoidable property. It is completely devoid of moral worth, simply because it does not result from a self-determining, neutral, indifferent choice.
Let me build an analogy here to see if this tracks with the practical world. Imagine you go to a specialty culinary shop and you drop $10,000 on a highly sophisticated commercial-grade espresso machine.
Oh, a really nice one.
Yeah, top of the line. It has precision burrs, perfect temperature control, and automated pressure profiling. You push a button, and it makes the flawless, world-class cup of espresso every single time without fail.
Sounds like a dream.
Right. And as the owner, you appreciate the machine. You enjoy the coffee immensely, but you do not look at the machine and attribute moral virtue to it.
Of course not.
You do not think the machine is a good person. It is just doing what its internal mechanics necessitate. It has absolutely no choice in the matter. So, is the Arminian logic actually suggesting that God is essentially just a cosmic, flawless coffee machine?
That is the inescapable conclusion of their own premise, whether they want to admit it or not.
Wow.
If you demand that authentic virtue requires the tangible ability to choose evil, then a God who cannot choose evil cannot be virtuous.
Which completely unravels their whole system.
It does. But when we look at the Reformed tradition, particularly the theology codified in the Westminster Confession, we see a stark and beautiful contrast.
Yeah, let's look at the contrast.
In Reformed theology, God is the very fountain and standard of all virtue. His absolute, unchangeable inability to sin is not a lack of freedom. It is not a handicap.
No, it's a perfection.
Yes, it is the absolute perfection of his nature. It is the very reason he is infinitely worthy of our esteem, our worship, and our praise. His goodness is not a neutral choice he happens to make on a whim. It is the essence of who he is.
So if necessity destroys praise, then God gets no praise. That is a devastating starting point for the Arminian argument. But let's follow Edwards as he moves this argument forward.
Okay, where to next?
Let's logically step from God the Father in heaven down to the incarnate Son on earth. Let's look at the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ.
That is a brilliant next step.
Right. Did Jesus possess this Arminian version of free will while he was walking around first-century Judea? Was his internal brass scale perfectly balanced between sin and righteousness?
To answer that question, Edwards bypasses the philosophical arguments entirely and goes straight to the text. He looks at the sheer volume of Old Testament promises guaranteeing the Messiah's success long before Jesus was even born in Bethlehem.
Because there are a lot of them.
Oh, there are hundreds. God the Father made absolute, unbreakable promises regarding the Son. In the book of Isaiah, specifically chapter 43, God promises to uphold his servant, explicitly stating that he will not fail nor be discouraged.
Right, that is a huge one.
God swore a covenant oath to David about an everlasting throne that the Messiah would occupy forever. There are countless prophecies asserting that the Messiah would execute perfect justice, that he would be a light to the Gentiles, and that he would see the travail of his soul and be completely satisfied.
And we need to clarify what a promise from God actually is, especially for you listening right now. A divine promise is not a weather forecast.
No, not at all.
It is not a prediction of a high probability based on current trends.
Yes.
It's an absolute ironclad guarantee of a future reality.
Yes, and that guarantee changes the mechanics of the situation entirely. These promises made it absolutely impossible for Christ to fail or to fall into sin.
Because God cannot break a promise.
Right. The outcome of his earthly life was entirely necessary. It could not have happened any other way without making God a liar. Edwards argues that if it was even theoretically possible for Christ to sin, then the whole system falls apart.
Like, if his will was hovering in a state of neutral equilibrium where he could have genuinely chosen to rebel against the Father.
Yes, if that were the case, then the entire salvation of the Old Testament saints was built on a sandy, fallible foundation.
Because God would have been justifying and saving people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses based on a future event that might not have actually happened.
That is exactly the point. God would have been leaning the entire weight of cosmic justice on a staff that could potentially break. Furthermore, we have to look at Christ's own behavior during his earthly ministry.
What do you mean?
Well, Jesus promised kingdoms to his disciples. He looked at them and told them they would sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Oh, right.
If his ultimate success on the cross depended on a neutral, unpredictable, self-determining human will that could have opted out at the last second, making those promises to the disciples would have been incredibly presumptuous.
Yeah, he would be promising eternal realities that he technically could not guarantee.
Precisely.
But I have to stop you there, though, because I know what someone listening to this is thinking.
What is that?
If the outcome was guaranteed from the start, and Christ could not possibly fail, how was his temptation in the wilderness real?
That is a very common question.
The Gospels tell us Satan tempted him for 40 days. If Jesus had no ability to choose sin, was the temptation just a theatrical performance? How can his earthly life be a model for us if his will was, as Edwards describes it, unalterably determined to good?
That is the most natural objection to raise, and it requires us to draw a sharp distinction between natural compulsion and moral certainty.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Christ did not obey the Father because he was physically forced to against his own desires. There was no external coercion overriding his will.
So no one was twisting his arm.
Right. He obeyed because his holy disposition perfectly and consistently aligned with the Father's commands. His obedience was necessary because of who he was, yet it was also completely willing. It was the purest expression of his highest desire.
So he could not sin because he absolutely hated sin and he absolutely loved the Father.
Spot on.
His inability to sin was an inability of character, not a lack of physical opportunity.
Right. And because it was a willing obedience flowing from a perfect, unblemished disposition, it was highly rewardable.
Which brings us to the book of Revelation.
Yes, we see the culmination of this in Revelation, where the heavenly hosts fall down and sing, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain."
They do not sing, "Lucky is the lamb who happened to make the right choice out of a state of indifference."
No, they don't. They praise his worthiness. His unalterable, necessary bias toward holiness is the very thing that makes him worthy of infinite praise.
So we have looked at the perfect, necessary obedience of Christ. Now we need to flip the spectrum and drop into the stark reality of the fallen human condition.
The dark side of the equation.
Yeah. What happens when a human will is totally determined toward evil? Edwards applies this exact same logic to the darkest parts of humanity.
He does, and the results are eye-opening. Edwards brings up individuals in the biblical narrative who were explicitly given over to sin by God.
Like who?
He points to Judas Iscariot betraying Christ. That betrayal was explicitly prophesied centuries in advance. Christ knew it would happen, told the disciples it would happen, and Judas was given over to the dark desires of his own wicked heart to accomplish it.
Wow, yes.
Edwards also points to Pharaoh in Egypt, or the rebellious Israelites during Jeremiah's time, who refused to worship Yahweh and acted out of a deeply hardened, entrenched rebellion.
Let's run the Arminian logic on these scenarios. If we apply the idea that necessity removes blame, we arrive at a conclusion that offends every fiber of human justice.
We really do.
If an action is necessary and unavoidable, then the person committing the action is completely innocent.
Under Whitby's rules, Judas is completely innocent. Because his actions were guaranteed by divine prophecy and driven by a heart that was totally hardened and bent toward evil, Judas lacked the liberty of indifference.
His scale was not balanced.
Not even close. He could not help but betray Jesus because his desires were so utterly corrupted. Therefore, according to the Arminian framework, he cannot be blamed for the betrayal.
This is where Edwards does something brilliant. He introduces a mathematical takedown of the Arminian position.
I love this part.
Let's walk through the math of this argument because it exposes the total absurdity of their premise.
Edwards reasons through it like a mathematical proof. He says, if total impossibility excuses a sin completely, then extreme difficulty must excuse it partially.
Okay, that makes sense on a proportional level.
This is a basic proportional truth. So, if a person has cultivated a massive, overwhelming habit of doing evil, that habit makes it very difficult for them to choose to do good.
It pulls them in one direction.
Right. It creates a strong internal necessity to sin. Therefore, the stronger a person's evil habits become, the closer they get to total impossibility, and proportionally, the less guilty they become.
Let's use the scale analogy again, but let's upgrade it to a modern digital smart scale.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine a machine that is required by its programming to push down with 10 pounds of force. That is its baseline duty.
10 pounds. Got it.
But someone comes along and places a heavy 9-pound counterweight on the other side of the mechanism. Now, the scale is severely hindered. It only has the remaining capacity to push with 1 pound of force.
Because of the heavy counterweight.
Right. According to Arminian logic, because of that 9-pound hindrance, you can only blame the scale for failing to produce that 1 single pound. You are required to excuse the other 9 pounds because the counterweight made it too difficult.
And when you take that mechanical logic and apply it to human morality, the results are catastrophic for any system of justice.
Completely.
By this logic, imagine a hardened serial killer who has spent decades cultivating a massive, ingrained, almost unbreakable habit of violence and cruelty.
A truly terrifying person.
Yes. He is heavily hindered from doing good by his own corrupted nature. Therefore, he is far less blameworthy for his next murder than, say, a gentle, kind-hearted saint who has a momentary lapse in judgment and tells a single white lie.
That is just mind-blowing.
The saint had a lot of liberty, a balanced mind, and very little habit pulling them towards sin, so they get maximum blame for the lie. The serial killer had almost zero liberty due to their horrific habits, so they get almost zero blame for the murder.
It's a complete and total inversion of justice.
It really is.
The worse you become, the more innocent you are considered. The more you hate God, the less guilty you are for rebelling against him.
Which leads us to look at a massive theological inconsistency in the Arminian system regarding the law of God itself.
Oh, this is a good point. Let's dig into that.
Arminians historically claim that it is fundamentally unjust for God to require perfect obedience from fallen humanity, precisely because we are unable to provide it.
So they think God's standard is unfair.
Right. They argue that Christ died to satisfy that old, rigorous, impossible law and to institute a milder law of sincere, imperfect obedience that we, in our fallen state, can actually manage to achieve.
Wait, think about that for a second. If the old law requiring perfect obedience was fundamentally unjust to begin with, because it demanded what we lacked the ability to give, why did Christ need to die to satisfy it?
That is the glaring contradiction Edwards exposes. Why would God offer a bloody infinite atonement to satisfy an unjust requirement?
You wouldn't.
If it is truly unjust to demand perfect obedience from a fallen creature, a righteous God could simply drop the demand. You do not need a sacrifice to appease an unjust law.
No, you just need a righteous judge to recognize the injustice, strike it from the books, and apologize for demanding it.
Exactly. Or, well, I should say that is 100% correct. The very fact that Christ had to die on a cross to satisfy the law proves that the original demand for perfect obedience was completely just, regardless of our fallen inability to meet the standard.
That raises the most common objection I hear from people wrestling with Reformed theology for the first time.
Let's hear it.
They hear this and they ask, if we have a moral inability to obey God, if our hearts are so corrupt that we cannot freely choose him, why does God still command us to do things we cannot do? Isn't that cruel?
That is the natural next question.
They think, isn't that like commanding a blind man to read a book or commanding a paralyzed man to run a marathon?
To answer that objection, Edwards provides a crucial, precise definition of what a command actually is. We have to understand the anatomy of a precept.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The human soul is the target of a precept, and the will is the specific faculty of the soul that either complies with or rebels against that precept. When God issues a command, it requires a certain state or act of the will.
The will is the focal point.
Yes. The very fact that the will opposes the command or lacks the inclination to obey it is the moral inability.
We need to spend some time here defining terms. We are dealing with two very different concepts: natural inability and moral inability.
Let's break them down. Natural inability means you lack the physical or mental capacity to do something, regardless of how much you might want to do it.
So, like, physics gets in the way.
Right. If I command you to fly to the moon by flapping your arms, or if a blind person is commanded to see a beautiful painting, that is a natural inability. Edwards fully agrees that natural inability completely excuses a person.
Because it's completely out of their hands.
Right. You cannot be blamed for failing to do what you physically do not have the faculties to accomplish.
But moral inability operates in a completely different category.
It does. Moral inability means you lack the desire, the inclination, or the willingness to do something. You have all the physical faculties required, but your heart hates the command.
You just don't want to do it.
Moral inability does not excuse a person at all. In fact, moral inability is the very essence of their rebellion. The inability to love God is not a physical handicap. It is the sin itself.
Let's map this onto a real-world scenario so you can visualize it.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine a guy goes to a casino in Vegas and he gambles away his entire life savings at the roulette table. Every last penny is gone. The very next week, the bank calls and demands his monthly mortgage payment.
Oh boy.
He checks his account and it is empty. He physically does not have the money. He has a very real inability to pay, but he cannot get on the phone and tell the bank manager, "It is fundamentally unjust for you to ask for this payment because I am unable to pay it."
The bank manager would laugh at him.
Right. Why does that argument fail? Because his inability is the direct result of his own fault. He squandered the funds, the bank's right to demand payment, and his moral obligation to pay it remains entirely intact regardless of his current bank balance.
That illustrates the historical reality of the human race perfectly.
How so?
In the Garden of Eden, humanity possessed the moral capital, the righteous disposition to obey God perfectly. Through the fall, humanity willingly squandered that capital and plunged the entire race into spiritual and moral bankruptcy.
We gambled it all away.
We did. But God's standard of perfect righteousness did not change just because we bankrupted ourselves. Our moral inability to love him perfectly is our own fault, and it consists entirely in our willful rebellion against him.
That is a harsh truth, but it makes so much sense.
We do not obey because we do not want to obey. And you cannot stand before a holy God and use your intense hatred of him as an excuse for failing to love him.
Knowing that humans fail these strict commands, a lot of people will retreat to a fallback position. They look for a theological loophole.
There is always a loophole people try to find.
They say, well, what if someone is genuinely trying their best? Doesn't God accept sincere intentions, even if the person lacks the moral ability to fully obey? If they are putting in a sincere endeavor, surely a loving God counts that for something.
Edwards anticipates this loophole, and he breaks down the concept of what he calls indirect willingness. We have to ask what people actually mean when they say someone is sincere but unable.
Sincerity is a tricky word.
It is. Edwards illustrates this brilliantly with the example of a drunkard. Imagine a man who is deeply physically addicted to alcohol. He has a strong, overpowering desire to keep drinking.
Okay.
However, he also realizes he is spending all his money, ruining his health, and driving his family into poverty. So he wants to stop drinking, but only because he wants to save his money and his reputation, not because he has developed any actual love for the virtue of temperance.
So his motivation is entirely financial and self-preserving.
Completely.
He still loves the alcohol. He just hates the consequences of being broke.
Right. So this man might make what looks to the outside world like a sincere endeavor to stop drinking. He might pour bottles down the sink. He might avoid the tavern. But his desire terminates on the money, not on the virtue.
The motive is wrong.
True sincerity, in a moral and spiritual sense, means the virtue itself is the direct object of the will. You seek holiness because you love holiness. You seek God because you love God.
Which means the drunkard's sincere endeavor actually contains zero actual virtue regarding temperance.
None at all. And you cannot balance the scales of God's infinite justice by adding massive amounts of zero-value actions.
You can't just pile on zeros.
No. If you have a scale with a heavy weight of sin on one side and you pile 1,000 actions onto the other side that are motivated entirely by self-interest and not by a love for God, those actions have zero moral weight. 1,000 times zero is still zero. The scale does not move a single millimeter.
Let's frame this with a familial scenario to make the emotional reality of this clear.
I like these analogies. Let's hear it.
Imagine a son who absolutely despises his wealthy father. He harbors deep, bitter hatred. He talks poorly about him behind his back.
A really toxic relationship.
Yeah, very toxic. But one day, the son realizes that his obvious hatred might cause his father to write him out of the will. He wants the estate.
Ah, the inheritance.
So the son decides to sincerely try to act lovingly. He visits his dad every Sunday. He buys him expensive gifts. He speaks kindly to him at dinner. But internally, his heart is still full of malice. His true target is the inheritance money.
He is just putting on a show.
Would any reasonable observer looking at the son's internal heart call those actions virtuous or loving?
No, they would call it what it is, manipulation. They would call it hypocrisy. The motive always defines the action.
It has to.
The action itself cannot rise above the principle from which it flows. If the foundational principle of the action is self-interest or a slavish fear of punishment, the action is not a virtuous act of love for God.
It is just self-preservation.
That is why Edwards argues so forcefully that these indirect desires, these sincere endeavors that fall short of true love for God, do not excuse us or earn us any merit before a holy God.
This systematic takedown dismantles all the standard excuses for moral inability. So let's pivot and look at the core definition of Arminian freedom one more time.
Back to the brass scale.
We keep coming back to this idea of liberty of indifference. If humans must be completely neutral to be truly free, what does that actually look like in everyday life?
It leads to an incredibly bizarre and disturbing view of human nature. For an action to be virtuous under Arminian logic, the heart must be indifferent at the exact moment of choice.
Like perfectly balanced.
Yes, the scale must be perfectly balanced, favoring neither good nor evil. Therefore, if you have a strong inclination toward doing good, if you actually love goodness and hate evil, that strong bias makes your action less free, because you are not indifferent.
And if it is less free?
According to their rules, it is less virtuous.
That completely destroys the concept of character building.
It really does.
It destroys the value of virtuous habits. If I spend years of my life developing a deep habit of kindness and generosity, my internal scale is heavily tipped toward kindness. I am no longer in equilibrium when I see a homeless person.
Right, you naturally want to help.
So according to this logic, my subsequent acts of kindness actually lack virtue because they flow from a biased, predetermined habit rather than a purely neutral choice. I'm being penalized for moral growth.
It absolutely penalizes character. But Edwards points out an even darker side to this philosophy.
What is that?
He points out the horrific nature of demanding indifference to severe evils. If equilibrium is required for freedom, then you must maintain a state of internal neutrality even when faced with monstrous, horrific choices.
Imagine you are walking near a fast-moving river and you see a close friend fall in. They cannot swim. They are drowning, screaming for your help.
A total crisis.
If you pause on the bank, forcing yourself to remain completely indifferent, weighing the options with zero bias in your heart toward saving them, isn't that state of indifference itself incredibly wicked?
It is the absolute definition of depravity. Being in a state of mind where you are equally likely to murder someone as you are to help them is not the pinnacle of human freedom.
No, it is the description of a monster.
Exactly. A total monster. A truly virtuous person does not have a neutral will when they see a friend drowning. Their will is violently biased towards saving them.
They are compelled by love, by empathy, and by duty.
To demand that the will must be neutral in order to be genuinely free is to demand that we strip ourselves of all moral compass, all love, all compassion, and all righteous indignation.
It is a terrifying way to view the world. Which brings us to the climax of this deep dive. If true freedom requires absolute neutrality, how does that affect the way God interacts with humanity?
This is a huge, huge point.
How do we make sense of the vast amounts of scripture, the preaching of the prophets, and the severe warnings found throughout the biblical text?
This is where Edwards delivers the final crushing blow to the Arminian system. We have to ask a functional question. How do motives and inducements work on the human mind?
How do they persuade us?
When you read a severe warning in the Bible, or hear a beautiful promise of heaven in a Sunday sermon, what is that information designed to do? It is designed to sway the mind. It is designed to create a bias. It is designed to tip the scales.
A motive's entire job is to destroy equilibrium.
Precisely. But if tipping the scales destroys the Arminian definition of freedom, then every single motive destroys virtue.
Because it removes the indifference.
Yes. Arminians will often point fingers at Reformed theology and accuse it of making God's warnings and invitations insincere. They argue, if God knows we are totally depraved and cannot choose him without a new nature, why does he invite us at all? It's a mockery.
But Edwards turns the tables completely and puts him on the defensive.
He does. He points out that if an invincible, overwhelming motive destroys freedom, then a small motive destroys a small amount of freedom. It works on a proportional sliding scale.
So any influence at all is bad for freedom.
Right. Therefore, any preaching you hear, any warning about the judgment of hell, any beautiful promise regarding the eternal joys of heaven actively works to destroy the listener's neutral free will.
The irony here is staggering when you think about it.
It really is.
Under the Arminian system, God supposedly values this neutral, indifferent free will above all else in the universe. It is the crown jewel of human existence.
They hold it up as the highest good.
Yet he fills the Bible with thousands of pages of warnings, threats, promises, and passionate pleadings. And if those biblical motives actually work as intended, if they actually persuade anyone, they'll destroy the very neutral free will God is supposedly trying to protect.
It makes God's use of persuasion entirely contradictory and self-defeating. If God truly wants us to remain in a state of perfect liberty of indifference, he should never speak to us.
He should just leave us alone.
He should never offer a reward. He should never threaten a punishment, because all of those things are explicitly designed to create a bias in our hearts. Edwards shows that the Arminian worldview collapses in on itself when you apply its own rules to how God actually communicates in Scripture.
We have covered massive intellectual and theological ground today. Let's summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive.
Let's do a quick recap.
We have seen that defining freedom as a neutral liberty of indifference fails on every conceivable level. It makes God's eternal holiness devoid of praise.
Right, the cosmic coffee machine.
It makes Christ's guaranteed earthly obedience somewhat of a cosmic gamble. It creates a mathematical nightmare where hardened, habitual criminals are technically less guilty than minor sinners.
That was a wild realization.
It excuses willful, hateful rebellion as mere natural inability. It values self-interested sincerity over actual, genuine virtue. It defines moral depravity as true freedom. And finally, it turns the entire Bible into a machine designed to destroy the very free will it supposedly champions.
The conclusion we arrive at, which is the beating heart of Reformed theology and echoes the doctrines of the Westminster Confession, is that human beings are always choosing exactly what they want to choose.
Our desires drive the bus.
They do. Our choices are real. They have consequences. And they are not coerced by outside physical forces against our will. However, our wants, our highest, most governing desires are dictated by our underlying nature.
A bad tree bears bad fruit.
Because it is in its very nature to do so. We are entirely free to act according to our desires, but because our desires are fallen and corrupt, we need a radically new nature in order to desire and act righteously.
We need a heart transplant.
We do. True virtue is not found in a neutral, uncaused choice hovering in a philosophical vacuum. True virtue is found in a heart that is completely captivated by and irrevocably biased toward the absolute goodness and glory of God.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, provocative thought to chew on as you go about the rest of your week.
Something to ponder.
We've established today that true freedom is acting according to your greatest desire. Consider the incredible biblical promise where God speaks through the prophet Ezekiel and says, "I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you."
Such a beautiful promise.
Notice very carefully what God does not say in that verse. He does not promise to give you a repaired, perfectly neutral choosing mechanism. He does not promise to balance your internal scales so you can figure it out on your own.
He bypasses the scales entirely.
He promises to fundamentally change what you love at the deepest possible level. If God sovereignly determines what you love most, are you somehow less free? Or, by having your desires finally aligned with the creator of the universe, have you finally been liberated to choose the joy you were originally created for?
That is a brilliant question.
Think about that brass scale sitting perfectly still in a vacuum. It is doing nothing. It is experiencing nothing. Real freedom is not an unmoving scale. It is a scale heavily permanently tipped under the glorious, joyful weight of knowing and loving God.
Amen to that.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Reformed thinking. We highly encourage you to go find Jonathan Edwards' Freedom of the Will and read the source text for yourself.